If you or someone you know has a story, encounter, or experience you would like to share with my viewers, please send it to my email at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. It was a Sunday afternoon in late June of 2016. I was camped in a developed U.S.A. campground on the Coconino National Forest in central Arizona in the Mogollon Rim area. The CG is situated in a canyon within a mixed forest of spruce, fir, oak, aspen, and other sort of pine. The cliff edge of the rim is about a 3/4 of a mile south of the CG. I was sitting in the shade and had just finished reading a work of fiction by James Patterson, which had a very strange ending. I was musing about the ending and just looking west across the CG, when a very fast-moving dark figure crossed the CG, heading from north to south. My first thought of a large kid on a bicycle, as it was moving so fast in the camp gravel road. But its travel path was counter to the road. Then I realized what it was that I had seen. It was a very large Bigfoot. The sighting only lasted about 3 seconds, and I was very lucky to have seen it at all. It crossed the CG in a shaded area and blended very well into its background, but the meadow beyond it to the west was bathed in afternoon sunlight and backlit the dark figure. It was about 125 yards from my viewpoint, so the facial detail was not clear. It ran with a slight forward cant to its body. I noted that the head did not bob up and down like a human runner's head at speed. The coat was almost black looking, but with the backlighting, I noticed a slight reddish tint to the figure's profile as it passed by. I had not noticed its legs or arm movement. Later, I went over to where the figure had crossed. On the north side of the drainage area, there was an area of crushed grass near the beginning of the travel path. Then the figure had moved south across the in-camp road and had gone into a depression in the high grass. There were other areas of crushed grass along its suspected travel route. Also, a crushed fern near the split rail fence that bordered the CG, where I suspect it had stepped over, crossed the forest road and went into the thick timber. I believe the earth's depression and a row of large logs obscured my view of its legs as it passed by. I had only seen its torso from the hips up, but did note the figure did not appear to have much of a neck, if any. The torso was very thick, and I guessed it was at least twice the thickness of a human. It was a once-in-a-lifetime event, as I said. I was very lucky to have seen the Sasquatch at all. Truly an awesome event which I will carry in my mind's eye forever. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I went to stay at a cabin we rented with my beautiful 2 children for the night. We were escaping the heat of Phoenix, and it was a beautiful day, clear, sunny, and no rain or clouds. That night, we were asleep in the cabin, but I kept waking up because I was on a very uncomfortable cot. As I lay there, trying to fall asleep again, I heard what sounded like a whoop. This was followed by a clear woodknock sound. They were about 8 to 10 seconds apart. I lay there listening, and about 1 minute later, I heard the same whoop, and again, followed up by another knock about 10 seconds later. They seemed to both come from the same direction, which was southeast of the cabin. I was the only one who heard it, as the kids were asleep, and I didn't tell them as I didn't want to spook them. The sounds sounded close. I'm guessing within 50 yards, since I was able to hear them while inside the cabin. There are a few other things that make this significant and eerie. One was that the time we arrived at the cabin, there was no wildlife or sounds, just birds chirping and the occasional wind blowing through the pine trees. We never heard a crack in the woods or any other wildlife sound. It was just quiet. So when I heard this, it stood out because we all heard nothing all afternoon, evening, and night. Another is that we drove down the road to the cabin. We only saw 2 to 3 other camping parties along the roughly 12-mile stretch to get to the cabin. It was a Sunday afternoon, about 2 p.m. when we drove to the cabin. But when we left the next morning, about 7 a.m., They had all left, assumingly the previous afternoon since it was a Sunday, so we were the only ones in the area of 12 miles back in the woods. We passed one truck near the main road as we left Monday morning, but that was it. Lastly was another noise we heard that I didn't put much credence into until after I heard the whoops. It was about 10:30 earlier that night, shortly after we climbed in bed. I was trying to fall asleep while the two kids were playing games on their iPods. All of a sudden, a rap noise hit the window on the south side of the cabin. Immediately, the kids look at me and say, "What was that?" The sound was like a small pebble hitting the window. Again, it was clear and visibly no wind. I played it off to the kids that it was probably just a moth or bug hitting the window, and it may have been just that. But then I heard the whoops and knocks later in the night and wondered if something was watching us. Whenever we camp, we always set up a camera trap for the fun of it, just to see what wanders in the camp. I did so on this night too, and it was set up in front of the cabin, but it had 0 hits on it. Not sure to what all this adds up to. The thing hitting the window could have just been a bug, but the whoops and the knocks I have no explanation for, and I clearly did hear them. While in Flagstaff, Arizona, my husband, mother-in-law, and I decided to take a chairlift ride. As we drove up Snow Bowl Road to reach the Arizona Snow Bowl, we saw a large tall figure walking in long strides through the trees. I would say about 40 yards from the desolate road. As an avid Finding Bigfoot watcher, our sighting was everything we heard and saw on the show. The squatch had to have been at least 8 to 9 feet tall. It was too far away to make out any features, but the way it walked, the posture, and the dark brown-black color, it was unmistakable. Definitely not a bear or deer. We saw the creature take 2 long strides through the trees and disappear. A feeling came over us of shock, fear, and amazement. I had goosebumps all over my body. We were camping out with a couple of my cousins, along with their kids, on 4th of July weekend at Wheatfields Lake, east side of the lake. We got there on Friday evening, which is July 3rd. We decided to camp there since there were lots of campers at the main campground, which is located on the west side of the lake, right off the highway. At 4 a.m. Saturday morning, my little boy woke and I started to tend to him. At 4:15, my girlfriend and I were sitting up inside the tent, feeding my little boy when we heard a loud, low-sounding roar coming near the west side of the campground. Immediately, some of the campers' dogs started to bark like crazy. I asked my girlfriend, "Did you hear that?" She replied, "Yes, what is it? It sounds scary." I told her that it's something huge with a good set of lungs. We heard it about 5 to 6 times. Duration of the calls would last like 10 seconds long. About 5 minutes later, the calls ceased, but we could still hear the dogs barking away. Then, at 4:45 a.m., we heard one more call from the same location. Afterwards, my girlfriend and my little boy went back to sleep while I stayed awake all morning. The next morning, I asked my cousins if they had heard the calls, and they said they didn't. On February 1st, 2007, I took my husband to Show Low, Arizona, to drop him off for 10 days with friends. The weather had been bad that day and progressively worsened so that I did not take my normal route back to New Mexico, which is through the White Mountain Apache Res. I went down the U.S. Highway 60. It runs between Show Low and Springerville, Arizona, past a small town called Vernon. The terrain loses almost all of the juniper trees and is mostly rolling grassy hills. I have learned a type of defensive driving in elk country, wherein you keep alert to the peripheral vision movement. Something drew my attention to the left-hand side of the road, and I applied my brake, anticipating an animal, like an elk, deer, pronghorn, etc. What I saw made me turn and pay attention. It was bipedal and running dead at the road. I slowed as fast as possible and watched in open-mouthed awe as the creature placed one hand on the T-post, which is a metal pole used in barbed wire fencing, and vaulted over the fence, slowing very little and continued running. It crossed the road, which was a 2-lane blacktop, in maybe 2 full strides and kept going into a narrow canyon far beyond my sight. I pulled to the side of the road and called my husband. He could not believe what I was saying. He finally asked me to get out of the car and look for tracks or hair or solid evidence. In very unladylike words, I told him no. I was alone, unarmed, and unwilling to meet something that big on a road that I had seen fewer cars in 2 hours than I had fingers on my hands. The creature was dark brown and had longish hair. I never saw its face full on. It had to be close to 7 feet tall or more. It never seemed to be afraid or running dead out, more like a lope or a steady jog. The weather was cold and heavily cloudy, mix of precipitation, off and on all day. No standing snow. I'm a chiropractor. One afternoon, a few weeks back, I was on my way from Show Low, Arizona, to a ranch past Concho, Arizona, to work with a horse. I'm a certified in animal skeletal adjustment, which is chiropractic for animals. Between the Y and the highway and Concho, about 6 miles outside of Concho, at about 2:30 p.m., on a clear sunny day, I saw something come up onto the road, about half a mile in front of me. At first, I thought it might be a very large dog, as it initially was coming up onto the road. But as it entered the highway, I could see that it stood straight up, to a height about as tall as a road sign, maybe 6 or 7 feet. It had long, dark brown hair from top to bottom, and stood absolutely straight up. No slouch, no forward bending at all. It ran across the road from my right toward my left, and remained fully standing as it ran off into the brush. The full incident took maybe 10 seconds. The area I live in is plentiful with big animals. Elk, deer, bear, big cats, and much more. Many of my patients come to see me for injuries after auto encounters with these big animals. I've had some very close calls myself. During the 12.5 years I've lived here, I've seen several animals I have never seen in the wild before. My far vision is incredibly good. It is my habit to drive hyper-vigilant for animals here. I'm quite familiar with bear movements since they are pretty well a nuisance to locals and spotted often here. It's the only other local animal that could have possibly fit the description as far as fur, color, and standing height. However, bears do not stand straight up to run across the road. In fact, they don't stand straight up at all. When they stand, they sort of hunch and hang their paws. This did no such thing. Immediately, I was very confused because I thought it looked like how a Sasquatch is described, but I didn't believe there might be any such thing as a Sasquatch and Bigfoot, in Arizona of all places. The Pacific Northwest? Maybe. But Arizona? It was beyond my conception. Since then, my wife and I have been looking for information on the web and have discovered that there have been sightings in this area for years by the White Mountain Apaches, who are generally pretty closed-mouthed about it. In retrospect, I realized I should have stopped and searched for tangible evidence, but I had an appointment and didn't want to be late. I'm fully convinced of what I saw and confident in my observation capacities. Myself and a friend were hunting this waterhole where deer and elk come to drink. The location is approximately 7 miles north of a small community of Sawmill, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation. It was during the archery elk season on the reservation of the very last day of the season, which happened to be Sunday. At about 6 p.m., we set up a small portable blind near the waterhole and crawled inside. We waited quietly for about a couple of hours or so. We observed some cattle that came in to drink. There was also a coyote that came to drink. At 8:30 p.m., the sun went down behind the ponderosa trees. We decided to crawl out of the blind and break the blind down. As we're taking the portable blind down, we heard a high-pitched scream that came about 200 yards northwest of the waterhole. We stopped and listened, thinking it was a bull elk. Again, the scream came 30 seconds after the first scream. Right then I said, "That don't sound like a bull elk at all." As I said that, another scream came which seemed to last a lot longer. At this point in time, we decided to leave the area. We didn't know if the scream was coming closer to our location. On the Navajo Indian Reservation, I was driving along the washboard dirt road, number 7, that heads east along the south side, looking for a place to duck into a camp for the night. I was about 7 to 10 miles east, driving at about 20 miles per hour. It stepped out from the left side and walked across the road right in front of me, about 40 feet away or so, right at the edge of the bright part of my headlights, walking briskly, but in no hurry, crossing the road and slightly away from me at the same time, so that it was probably 5 feet ahead when it reached the other side of the road. As soon as it crossed the road and the little swale of a ditch, it bent over just as it was behind a bush, as if to take cover as soon as possible. At first, all I kept thinking was, I just saw an ape of some kind, but I quickly realized what it had to be. It wasn't particularly large, about 6 feet tall or so, but very solid for its size, and uniformly covered in dark brown hair. It never looked at me once. I only saw it for about 3 or 4 seconds, but saw it clearly. I ended up going back a little, turning north on a paved road that leads to the edge of the canyon, just a mile or so, and turning off into the woods a little to sleep in the back of my truck for the night, just 2 or 3 miles at most from where the sighting occurred. Well, this happened twice in our area, which is on the Navajo Reservation in the northeast corner of Arizona. Midwinter in 1979, myself and other neighborhood kids were playing in a recently fallen snow, and out of the darkness was heard the most terribly and interesting scream that we've ever heard. And this scream lasted for about 15 minutes on and off. Now at the time, I remember there being reports of a giant man taking sheep from corrals, but I didn't believe it until that night. The time must have been around 12 p.m., which is ironic about this incident is that it did not only happen once, but twice 3 years later in the same conditions, and there were low-key rumors at the time. Now this hasn't bothered me, but I sure would like to know how it ever wandered into our region for a fact. In our oral history, our elders spoke of these men who will come and take you away if you're bad. I mean, just put 2 and 2 together. Now this had to be a Bigfoot, because on several recordings, the sounds are identical to what we heard that night. And even on an episode of Sightings, the night cry was identical. This just gives me the creeps to know that at the time we were probably being watched. One summer morning of the year 1989, myself and a forestry technician were just finishing up a routine spotted owl survey in the northern part of the Chusca mountain range. After calling for owls at a call point just before sunrise, we began to walk back to the vehicle when we heard a loud, deep yell and roar from down below our position. The habitat was a mixed conifer stand within a deep, dark canyon. Since there are sheep camps throughout the mountain range, it did cross our mind that perhaps somebody, a human, was yelling, but the distinct factor that myself and the technician had agreed upon was that the yell was very deep and long, which lasted approximately 5 seconds. After the vocalization, the echo itself retained the deepness of the sound as it traveled through the canyon below us. This was definitely not a human that had the lung capacity to make such a sound. After researching it a bit more recently, about Sasquatch sightings, audio clips, and more, my theory is the animal, whatever it was, may have been responding to our sounds, since we were calling with the imitated vocalization of the Mexican spotted owl. I've listened to several audio clips of recorded Sasquatch vocalizations, and can see where one may have mistaken us for another creature of its kind. It was my first day of the 1981 Navajo deer season. I have hunted these Lukachukai mountains for deer throughout my teenage years with my brother T, Uncle DJ, and cousins. I was 20 years old then. It was about 7 a.m., November 7th, 1981, when our hunting crew reached the top of the mountain, southwest of Cove, Arizona. The weather was cold with shifting fog. The ground was frozen from the drizzle the night before. 2 cousins and I were to walk the upper mountain ridge that acred to the northwest. I packed my pack and loaded my rifle. By then, my cousins had already walked ahead of me, on a well-used trail which rounded a hill to a saddle which splits the mountain range. I wanted to catch up with them, so instead of following the trail, I climbed up the hill and over. As I reached the top and began to go down the other side, I stopped and yelled my cousin's name to locate them. I first heard a crashing of oak brush below me about 40 to 50 yards to my left. I could not believe what I was seeing walking down the hill on 2 legs. The oak brush was about armpit height on the thing. By then, the smell had reached me, which was musky, wet, smelly hair, an undescribable scent. I was shocked. The thought of shooting it came to mind as I watched it through my rifle scope, but it walked similar to a human. I did not shoot. I watched it walk down to the big trail below, about 70 to 80 yards and into the forest. I then hurriedly made my way back down the north towards the forest road we came up on, and stayed on the road back to the meeting area to the northwest end of the ridge. I think it followed because of the movement I could hear in the oak brush while walking on the road. I shot once to scare whatever was moving in the oak brush. What I saw was a very large black hairy being that walked upright on 2 legs. The upper body was broad and muscular. The hair appeared coarse. The smell was bad, and I can only say what I saw that day was a Bigfoot. It's taken me a long time to write this because shortly after the incident, I managed to convince myself that it could not have been a Bigfoot. A few months later, a friend had a nearly identical incident at the same location, which made me reconsider. As a mechanical engineer, I am trained in the hard sciences, and as such, I am a scientist. I really don't believe in something unless there is hard evidence or the scientific community is in agreement. Since the incident and my friend's incident, I have been doing a lot of research and feel that there is substantial evidence that a forest primate exists in North America. As a scientist, my previous position was that something could exist, but there was not enough evidence to prove it. I do admit that I always have had an interest in the Bigfoot phenomenon, and knew some things about it like wood knocking, howls, you know. I also took a natural anthropology class in college. My teacher was one of the most famous anthropologists of our time, and I learned well about all of the primates, early hominids, and of course, Gigantopithecus. My point is that I am an intelligent person who had an informed, skeptical position concerning the Bigfoot phenomenon, but has come to believe that the forests are inhabited by either an early hominid or a great ape, or something in between. I am known for my situational memory, and feel that my remembrance of the incident has not diminished. I have told my story many times, and every time I get goosebumps. It was August of 2010. My wife, brother, father-in-law, and I were camping on the Mogollon Rim. We were in my favorite spot in a remote location on the Apache Sitgreaves Forest that I had been frequenting for about 2 years. We were not doing any particular activities like shooting or hunting. We were not riding quads or anything. It was a 2-night camping weekend for us, and for the most part, we were just hiking and relaxing and observing elk. The oddest thing about this weekend was that there was almost nobody in the area of the forest. A lot of people avoid camping during the monsoon, although this weekend was basically dry. The closest campsite was about 2 miles away. It was occupied by 2 older couples whom I had spoke to earlier that day of the incident. The other notable observation was that it was a pitch-black, moonless night, in which it must have been overcast, because I could only see about 3 to 5 feet. In retrospect, I cannot imagine these 2 elderly couples creeping 2 miles into my camp on foot without lights, just to disturb us in our sleep. Also, Arizonans are known for their gun toting. It is never wise to approach somebody's camp unannounced, especially in the middle of the night of a pitch black night. I have been an outdoorsman since I can remember, and am also an accomplished hunter. I'm familiar with the Arizona fauna and the sounds they make. At about 12 a.m., I was awoken to the sound of 2 sticks cracking together near my RV trailer. The knocking sounded as if somebody had 2 girthy sticks, maybe 2 inches in diameter, and they were banging them together at a perfect 2-second interval. Sometimes the sticks sounded a little different, as if a knot had been struck, but the timing was never flawed. Now, a lot of people say, well, that could have been an elk's antlers or some bird cracking his beak. But I have never heard of a known animal make this sound, let alone in perfect repetition for the duration that I heard it. But that wasn't the strangest part. The sound was translating through the forest rather quickly, and without making additional sounds. The sound was emanating from an area on the back side of my trailer, and receding away. It would then come closer and recede again. This was happening over and over. I would say that it was probably about 20 to 30 yards at the closest, and went out an additional 50 to 70 yards away. My campsite was near a primitive road, and the sound seemed to parallel the road, but I can't be sure. After lying in bed, listening to this for about 2 minutes, I decided that I needed to do something about this thing that was disturbing my camp. Familiar with the observance that Bigfoots knocked wood, a Bigfoot did come to mind instantly, but I felt that as the patriarch, I needed to investigate and protect my family. My family members were all 3 asleep, and I believe there may have been some snoring going on which may have given the creature some comfort to continue doing this. I was sleeping in my underwear and decided to get dressed. I got dressed more quietly than ever before, or since I am certain that I made no sound that the creature could hear. I did not turn on any lights and was absolutely silent, feeling around for my clothes, shoes, and pistol. Once dressed, I moved silently to the trailer door, being careful not to shake the trailer or create any noise. This was actually quite easy, because there is a door adjacent to my bed. I waited until the cracking sound had receded as far away as it sounded like it was going to get. And remember, the sound was emanating from the opposite side of my trailer. I slowly opened the door, again careful not to make a noise. The knocking sound continued. This is the part that freaks me out the most. As soon as I stepped outside, the knocking sound that seemed as far away from me as possible stopped. Now perhaps the trailer made a creaking sound when I put my weight on the metal step, but I had the distinct feeling that something, another creature, had seen me get out of the trailer. For some reason, the door opening did not cause the sound to stop, but when I got out, whatever was creating that cracking sound decided to stop, even though it was around 70 or 100 yards away. I had the feeling that if something saw me, it would be beyond the rear of my trailer. The door that I had just opened would have blocked the view of me from the front of the trailer. A position to the rear would have nicely triangulated a view of me and the wood-knocking creature. In short, I got the distinct impression that there was a second creature serving as a lookout. Now the story does not stop there. I had a lousy flashlight which was unlit in one hand and my pistol in the other. I proceeded around the front of my trailer to the other side. Once I was on the other side, I was confronted by the pitch-black woods in which I was certain that there were a couple of unknown creatures. Having the distinct feeling that there was something to the rear of my trailer, I shined the lousy flashlight directly towards the rear. This only lit up 2 very large pine trees that were about 12 feet in front of me. Shining the flashlight did, however, elicit a response. As soon as I shone the light directly in front of me, but on the other side of the trees, perhaps about 20 to 40 yards away, something let out a whoop whoop. It was clear, it was distinct, and it was amazing. Before this incident, I had never heard on TV that Bigfoots made a whoop whoop sound, so I am certain that this was not in my head. At that moment, I knew that there was something different from an elk, a bear, an owl, etc. that was disturbing my camp. And I also knew that there was a creature, and more than one. I felt like this was an alert call, signaling any additional creatures to leave the area. During my time outside of the trailer, I was very conscientious of the observances that Bigfoot is supposed to smell. I specifically sniffed the air, trying to get an indication of a bad smell, but never smelled anything. It was a temperate night. The air was a bit cool, probably in the low 60s, but I didn't smell a thing. Right after the whoop whoop, my wife began to stir, turning on lights and going to the restroom. I went back around the front of the trailer near the door I exited from, and my wife was standing there asking me what was going on. I told her that there is something out here. I don't know what it is, but there is something out here. Surprisingly, maybe because I knew they were scared away, I was able to fall asleep shortly thereafter. My wife told me that before she went back to sleep, that she heard a couple of knocks too. Of course, I had told her what I had heard, and it may have been fresh on her mind as she started to fall asleep. She did wake me up to tell me, but I didn't hear anything, and we both fell asleep. My brother and father-in-law never really woke up during the incident. I would say the incident lasted maybe 10 minutes from the moment I first woke up until the whoop whoop was heard. The next day, I searched the road and any sandy areas in the area for footprints. I am an experienced animal tracker, but found 0 tracks. As we discussed, the event I grabbed 2 ponderosa pine branches that I thought approximated what I had heard. I cracked them together, and it sounded fairly similar. I experimented with different sizes and materials, oak, aspen, and pine. I felt like 2-inch diameter pine sticks with the bark removed sounded closest to what I had heard. The last week of November, that same year, my friend and his dad and brother were staying in my exact same campsite, hunting elk. My friend heard the 2-second wood-knocking rhythm, translating through the woods just like I had for quite a few minutes. I believe his dad and brother did not really stir. He did not go out to confront it, and it eventually stopped.